We criminalized alcohol, heroin, and other drugs in this country early in the last century, and somehow, while we seem to recognize that locking people up during alcohol prohibition was a massive failure that only enriched gangsters and led to grotesque violence, we've yet to learn that lesson about other drugs.
If you ask the question, why are some drugs legal and others illegal? Why are cigarettes and alcohol legal and pharmaceuticals in the middle and these other drugs, marijuana, other ones illegal? Some people sort of inherently assume, well, this must be because there was a thoughtful consideration of the relative risks of drugs, but then you think, well, that can't be, because we know alcohol is more associated with violence than almost any illegal drugs, and cigarettes are more addictive than any of the illegal drugs. I mean, heroin addicts routinely say it's harder to quit cigarettes than it is to quit heroin. So it's not as if there was ever any kind of National Academy of Science that 100 years ago decided that these drugs, these ones had to be illegal and those ones legal. And it's not as if this is in the Bible or in the Code of Hammurabi. I mean, nobody was making legal distinctions among many of these drugs back until the 20th century, essentially. So if you ask how and why this distinction got made, what you realize when you look at the history is it has almost nothing to do with the relative risks of these drugs, and almost everything to do with who used and who was perceived to use these drugs.
But there's another endless war that has killed far more Americans and destabilized the world. We have lost 800,000 people in this war in the past 30 years alone, and it's cost more every year than offering free child care to every family in America.
The first anti-cocaine laws were in the South in the early part of the 20th century, directed at black men working on the docks, and the fear, what would happen to those black men when they took that white powder up their black noses and forgot their proper place in society, going out. First time anybody ever said that, cops needed a 38 would not bring down a Negro crazed on cocaine, you needed a 45. I mean, the New York Times, the paper of record reporting this stuff as fact back in those days. That's when you got the first cocaine prohibition laws. The first marijuana prohibition laws were in the Midwest and the Southwest, directed at Mexican migrants, Mexican Americans, taking the good jobs from the good white people, going back home to their communities, smoking a little of that funny smoking, marijuana, reefer, cigarette. And once again, the fear, what would this minority do to our precious women and children? So, it's always been about that.
Specifically on the addiction crisis, how does your view of addiction differ from sort of the current regime? How would you change the way that we deal with addiction in this country?
No, it's a similar principle, Crystal, where we're excessively punitive in this country. And that if you become addicted and somehow we're like, well, tough it out, recover on your own.
You see it as a moral failing.
Yes, we can tell it's a structural problem, and you can see that with Purdue Pharma now on the verge of bankruptcy because it's forfeiting billions of dollars in blood money. I mean, the federal government was negligent in allowing us to get to a point where you had hundreds of thousands of opiate prescriptions. You had more opiate prescriptions in the state of Ohio than people in the state of Ohio at one point. And that was on the government's watch. And then we somehow hold individuals accountable for becoming addicted when you had companies that profited to the tune of tens of billions of dollars on the backs of those addictions.
And it wasn't as if the white Americans weren't also consuming. It's just many of them knew that when you criminalize a vice that is engaged in by a huge minority of the population, and you leave it inevitably to the discretion of law enforcement as to how to enforce those laws are not typically going to be enforced against the whiter and wealthier and more affluent or middle-class members of society. Inevitably, those laws will be disproportionately enforced against the poorer and younger and darker-skinned members of society. So to some very good extent, that's really what the war on drugs has been about. When people talk about it as the new Jim Crow, in this wonderful book by Michelle Alexander with that title, it's about understanding that, the war on drugs is not just about race, and it's not just about targeting black and brown young people, because God knows, millions of white people have been swept up in the war on drugs as well. But it is disproportionately and overwhelmingly about that, from its origins to its enforcement to who gets victimized today.
If you believe that addiction is a public health issue, why are we putting people in jail when they should be receiving treatment?
We have to stop punishing people for becoming hooked on these drugs, we have to say, look, if you're an addict, we're going to refer you to treatment and not a prison cell. I would decriminalize opiates that are being used for personal use and aren't being distributed. So in addition to decriminalizing marijuana, I would decriminalize opiates for personal use.
That's a big deal. I mean, does that include heroin?
Yes, it does. I mean, at this point, what's happened is you had this OxyContin addiction that has morphed into fentanyl and heroin,
right,
which are frankly more accessible and sometimes less expensive than the OxyContin that started the addiction chain.
I'm familiar with the Portugal model, what they've done, because it's very similar to what you're saying. They essentially decriminalized all drug use, including heroin. They have injection sites where people can go and be dosed, but also have access to treatment rather than being thrown in prison. We're not talking about dealers here. We're talking about individual addicts. I mean, is that consistent with what you're talking about here?
Yeah, I was inspired by Portugal's success, where in the wake of this change in approach, they saw a massive reduction in both overdose rates and substance abuse rates. So I'm for safe injection sites, safe consumption sites, and I'm for referring addicts to treatment instead of jail.
On July 1st, 2001, Portugal became the first country in the world to decriminalise all drugs. What that means is while they remain illegal, possessing small amounts of anything from cannabis to cocaine or even heroin doesn't result in arrest. Users aren't considered as criminals, but rather treated as patients in a health-first approach. Instead of facing a judge, they meet a dissuasion panel made up of lawyers, social workers and medics. Before decriminalisation, around 90% of funds spent on fighting drugs went on enforcement and just 10% on healthcare. After 2001, that was reversed. The number of Portuguese in rehab programs rose from just over 6,000 in 1999 to nearly 26,000 in 2008, while those using heroin has fallen from about 100,000 to around 50,000 today, and drug-related deaths have fallen dramatically. In 2015, Portugal had just 6 deaths per million people, the lowest in Western Europe, and a tiny fraction of that in the US.
That's right. Andrew Yang has committed to ending the pointless and cruel war on drugs in favor of the Portugal model. In Portugal, simple possession of any drug, including heroin, including cocaine, is not a criminal offense. They don't send people to jail for being addicts, even if the drug they possess is heroin. Instead, they offer treatment, they offer jobs, they offer methadone and other medically based treatment. Portugal's response to catching someone with a 10-day supply of heroin is to offer them help, not jail. And how's that working out for them? Well, Portugal saw its overdose death rate drop 85% since decriminalization, where we lost nearly 70,000 people to opioid overdoses last year alone. Portugal lost 20 people. There are about 500,000 people in this country incarcerated today for nonviolent drug offenses, disproportionately, of course, people of color. 500,000 families destroyed. We could have these citizens back and give them the help that they need instead. We've been attempting to end drug use through prohibition for more than 100 years. And yet here we are, with the worst addiction crisis in our nation's history. It is time to admit this policy has failed. And while full decriminalization may seem radical, what is truly insane is staying the course.